and good evening, everybody, and welcome to Don't Stop Me Now. It is our final week of our BLT series. We've had 4 weeks, 4 wonderful, wonderful speakers. We're going to hear the 4th one tonight. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we are joined by Reb Aaron Lansky, who is the founder and president of the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. It's a non-profit organization working to recover, celebrate, and regenerate Yiddish and modern Jewish literature and culture. You see, guys, since 1980, Mr. Lansky and his colleagues have rescued more than 1 million Yiddish books, most of which would otherwise have been lost or destroyed. So it is wonderful to have Reb Aaron with us this evening. Very excited to hear his story and to hear some of the amazing inroads he's making with his work out there in the States. As with the previous 3 weeks, tonight's learning is dedicated in honor and in memory of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, in the merit of Reb Yaakov Tzvi ben David Aryeh. We will be hearing from Mr. Lansky, and a little later we are going to have an opportunity for you to ask your questions as well. So that's all coming up, so stay tuned, get yourselves comfortable. We're going to start in just a moment, but first, I'm just going to quickly plug the Bereshit program, which is going to be our next big learning opportunity at the end of December. Details will be on Facebook and in the emails. It's a lovely opportunity to embrace the warmth of the festive period from the comfort of your own homes and to enjoy some wonderful speakers, some wonderful content, some wonderful education. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, spotlighted on your screens for this evening, drum roll please, here he is, Mr. Aaron Lansky.
Rabbi, thank you for that very enthusiastic introduction. So I have to tell you, I didn't realize I was going to be able to see most of the people in the audience while I'm speaking. That makes my job a whole lot easier. And since I can sort of see many of you, I'm going to start with a question. Does anybody here actually speak Yiddish? You have to raise a hand because I can't hear you. So a little bit. All right. I'm only getting a percentage of people. So I'm going to, and then I'll ask one other question. This is even less likely. Has anyone been to the States, traveled to Amherst, Massachusetts, a small college town, to actually visit the Yiddish Book Center? That's kind of what I figured. All right, in that case, I have my work cut out for me. Well, the Book Center was an organization that I founded when I was still a graduate student studying Yiddish literature in Montreal. And I took what I thought was going to be a 2-year leave of absence to head off and save the world's Yiddish books, which I felt were in danger of extinction. That was 40 years ago. At the time, scholars thought there were about 70,000 volumes still to be saved. We did that in 6 months' time, and we've gone on to save about 1.5 million volumes. And I guess technically I'm still on leave from graduate school. So if you could come to Amherst and you could actually see our building, it's quite distinctive because it sort of looks like a shtetl, like a Jewish town in Eastern Europe. It's wooden construction. It has double roof lines, a vernacular form taken from Eastern Europe. You walk across a wooden footbridge to enter. And as you walk inside the building, there are quotations on either side of the wall. One of the quotations on the left-hand side is in English, and it's a quote from a man named Max Weinreich, who was a great Yiddish scholar who had been in Vilnius. He was, through extraordinary good fortune, was delivering a lecture in Denmark on the day of the Nazi invasion in September 1939. So obviously that saved his life. He came to America, he reconstituted his organization in the States. He tried his best, but he was one of the great Yiddish scholars in the world, but in the United States at that time, he had almost no students. And one day, one of his students came to him and said, Professor Weinreich, how do you go on? You know, nobody's here, nobody's studying with you. How can you keep doing this? And Weinreich said, I can tell you very simply, he said, it's because Yiddish has magic. It will outwit history. When I first heard that story, I said, I've got the title for my book. It was just kind of perfect. And we put the quote up on the wall. On the other side is a quote entirely in Yiddish from a woman named Kaja Molodowski, a great Yiddish writer. And her quotation reads, "On wer wird über mich in gelbe Blätter?" It's a line from one of her poems. Who will leaf through these yellowed pages? Meaning, who in the world's going to ever read these books in the first place? As I started to think about what I wanted to tell you tonight, I figure both of those quotations are apt because they sort of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about. I did write a book on all of my adventures, the many years I spent collecting books. I happen to have one copy of the British edition here. I don't know if that's still current or not, but I wrote the book's called Outwitting History, and it tells the story of all the years that I was out there doing this. In many ways, it's really an adventure story, and you'll read all kind of very exciting moments, how we once, shortly after I founded the organization, I got a call from New York City from a friend of mine who said that there was a garbage dumpster. What do you call it? A skip? Is that the word you use? Yeah, there was a skip on the street loaded to the top with Yiddish books. Said, you got to get down here right away. It was snowing outside. It took all sorts of machinations to get there. But I finally arrived about 6:30 the next morning to find that pouring rain and snow and sleet. And there were 8,000 Yiddish books out on the street there. Many of them had fallen into the street and cars were running over them and they're splayed out like that. We found out later there had been an old Zionist organization, had closed some years before. They had left their books in a basement storeroom for safekeeping. The building was being made over into condominiums, and someone for 3 or 4 days, the workmen had been hauling the books out, throwing them into the dumpster. And it was only when they finally overflowed that I got the phone call and we were able to save them. Obviously, it's a powerful metaphor, but it was also a difficult day out there. We spent about 12 hours in the rain that day. I ended up with 104-degree Fahrenheit fever by the next day. But it was typical. Another time, we got a phone call that there was a very large Yiddish library at an old cooperative housing project in the Bronx, also in New York City. And private landlord had taken over the cooperative. And one of the first things he decided to do was to get rid of the library so he could rent out the space for commercial use. Didn't tell anybody, he just sent in workers. They tore the place apart. They tore down the ceiling. They tore the shelves off the walls. Books are piled everywhere. And he said, I have a dump truck coming at 4 o'clock this afternoon to haul all of this off to the dump. I'll give you till then to save what you can. We could barely make a dent in it until I realized that what had once been a largely Jewish housing development was now primarily Black and Puerto Rican. And there were a lot of young kids in the neighborhood. And as we're working, one of these kids comes up to me, he was 11 years old, and he said, what are you guys doing? And I explained what this was, that Jews had once lived there, and these were their books that had been left behind. He said, do you need help here or something? I said, do we need help? He ran off, he organized a bunch of kids from the neighborhood, maybe a dozen kids. He organized them all into a kind of, what do they call, we call it a bucket brigade, the firemen have, and they started handing the books out of the room, up the stairs and out to the truck. And we saved the entire library that day. I think every single kid in the neighborhood slept with the exception of this boy who organized it. He was the foreman and supervised all the rest of them. Oh God, we pulled books out of fetid basements, demolished buildings. Once we got there just in time to save them from an approaching hurricane. Another time we managed to save the entire Yiddish library of a major, Yiddish collection of a major public library in New Jersey. The books were about to be destroyed and we got a tip to go in at the last minute. The newspapers used to love these stories, these last minute rescues. It's very dramatic. They would often make the front page of the paper. A lot of people at newspapers, of course, have an affinity for books and the written word, and were very attracted to this, whether they were Jewish or not. But they often, by kind of focusing on the sensational parts, they often miss the best part of the story, which wasn't what happened in the garbage dumpsters and, on the demolition sites. The best part was what happened at the kitchen tables, because more often than not, we used to go to the homes, meaning the rather poor apartments of elderly Jews, and they would be waiting for us. They would have big meals, all prepared when they knew we were coming. Keep in mind, we do this like 10, 12 times in a single day. But we would walk in, and of course, the first thing they would do, sit us down at the kitchen table. I don't know if they have this custom where you are, but they'd serve a glass of tea, a hot tea in a glass. Do they have that where you are among all the Jews? Yes, so hot tea in a glass. And they would pull the Luxen Kiglach, the Luxen Kugel out of the oven, and the Jewish cakes out of boxes. They would then speak to us in Yiddish to make sure that we were sufficiently erudite to actually receive these books. Then they would try to make shidduchim, to arrange marriages with their granddaughters for us. And when all that was done, then finally they'd start handing us the books. But they never just like said, okay, here are the books, go take them. They would literally, sometimes they'd have 300, 400, 500 books. They would literally hand them to us one volume at a time. I remember what they would say, apartment after apartment, they would say the same thing. They'd say, Junger Mann. What does Junger Mann mean? It means young man, and that became my kind of generic name in the Yiddish world at that time. They'd say, Junger Mann, what is unser Yerusha? This is our inheritance. This is what we're leaving to the world. This is our great treasure. It's not a Mercedes-Benz. It's not great wealth and riches and stocks. What we're leaving to the world are these Yiddish books. More often than not, their kids weren't interested in them. The grandchildren had no clue what they were and sometimes hadn't even heard of the language. And so it was left to us. Keep in mind, at the time, I was 24 years old when I started out. You know, I was dressed in torn jeans and a t-shirt, and I had a pretty big beard and an awful lot of hair in those days, as did my traveling companions, also young people. I'm not sure I would have trusted us, but they really had no choice. And so they just kind of embraced us, you know, in every sense of the word, and handed over this great treasure to us. So, you know, working 16 hours a day, driving around in these rattle-trap rented trucks, sleeping on the floor at night, that was the easy part. The hardest part was to avoid overeating on these expeditions. And I got to just explain that. Should I give you one example? I have to just keep an eye on the time so I don't overdo this, but I'll give you one example. One day I got a call from the New York Times. They used to run a column called A Day in the Life. They'd find, you know, somebody who was doing something interesting, send a reporter out to spend a full day with them and then write about it in the paper. So we said, we want to send a reporter to do a day in the life of the Yiddish book collector. Okay, that sounds fine. They said, we have a reporter named Doug McGill. Well, that was not a Jewish name particularly, but I said, okay. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, there's this couple out in Seagate, Brooklyn, the very tip of Coney Island. I said, they organize all our collecting down there. Why don't we meet at their house at 7 o'clock in the morning? And then we'll go from there and we'll make the rounds and you can follow us as we go. So we get to this family, the Ostrovs, our favorite Zomlers of book collectors, 7 in the morning. Doug's waiting for me. He's like 6'3", came from Minnesota. He'd only been in New York for, I think, less than a year at that point. But I introduced him to Mrs. Ostroff, to the woman whose house it was. I said, Mrs. Ostroff, this is Doug McGill from the New York Times. And Mrs. Ostroff goes like this. I said, yes. She says, first of all, what does the word Doug mean in Hebrew? Dog or dog, what does it mean? Fish, right? Dog is a fish in Yiddish, dog. So she says like this, why do they call him a fish? And I said, they don't call him a fish. It's his name, Doug. It's an English name. She says, oh, no, you can't fool me. She says, I come from Vilna. I know Lashon Kodesh, meaning Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, Hebrew, she said, and I know that it means fish. Well, we get through all of that. And then we go into the house and I'm thinking, oh God, I didn't tell them not to make a meal because usually we get there and they have something waiting for us. We walk in the kitchen and to my great relief, there's nothing on the table. And then I look off to the living room on the side and I said, uh-oh. And it says, mir geworden finster vor die Augen. There's a big, long aluminum table set up, a folding table. And on it is piled like every milchik, every dairy food known to humankind. We got like 6 different kinds of herring and the kigel and the blintzes and the whitefish and the gefilte fish. I'm assuming all these ring a bell for you guys as well, right? But these are also popular Jewish foods in the UK too. And I said, what's going on here? They said, well, a reporter for the New York Times, we figured he would need to learn about Jewish food so he could write about it. So they had set out this whole meal. Doug was a very good sport. He managed to eat like just about everything. And then at the end of the whole encounter, we're ready to get up from the table and he's got like this much matzah brai left behind on his plate. And Mrs. Ostroff looks at this tiny bit of matzah brai and she looks at Doug with utter disdain. And then she says to me in Yiddish, it's no wonder they call him Doug. He eats like a fish, meaning he doesn't have much of an appetite because he left this behind. Well, we get in the truck that day. We had 10 stops, I think we had arranged. Every single apartment we went into, the Zelba Moshe Kapoya, the exact same thing happens. We get there and the table is set and there's a huge feast waiting for us. So I said to Sam Ostroff, who had arranged all this, I said, Sam, what's going on here? He says, Okay, so maybe I told them that we were coming with someone from the New York Times, and everybody had exactly the same instinct to arrange this ethnographic opportunity for the Times to learn about Jewish food. At the end of that day, Doug said to me, you know, I'm a young reporter. I usually get all the lousy assignments if somebody's dumping toxic waste in New Jersey and they send me out there and no one wants to talk to me. He said this was the only story he'd ever covered where every single person he met, he said, they fed him first and then kissed him before he left. So he ended up becoming very close friends with these people in Seagate for the rest of their lives. I have to also tell you, we used to carry a Boy Scout canvas knapsack with us in the truck. And in it were all sorts of antacids. I don't know if the brand names would be familiar, Alka-Seltzer and Pepto-Bismol and Japanese umeboshi plums and everything we could manage just to keep ourselves reasonably focused after all this food we were eating and all these meals that we would have to do. In fact, it got so bad that I always started traveling in a group of 3. We would have 2 to do the schlepping, and the third was the designated eater and would keep the people busy while we hauled the books out of there. My book is still in print, I think, in the UK. So I'm going to refer you to the book for the rest of all these stories about what happened in those early years. All I can tell you is there are like hundreds of adventures just like this. But the reason I want to kind of rush over that and move along is only because so much has happened. That was 15 years ago that I wrote that book. And when I finally finished it, I said to my wife, I said, you know, I think I'm going to write a second book. And my wife gives me this look and she said, yeah, maybe with a second wife. Because at that point, she'd kind of had it with 5 years of my, writing day and night. But the truth is I am working on a new book now. But the new book tells a very different story. Because if the first book was really about an older generation who passed on that Yerusha, that inheritance to us, the new book is about people much younger than I, about, high school students, college students, young people in their 20s and 30s who are learning Yiddish and studying with us and working with us and opening up this culture in ways that we never really could have imagined. When I told my younger daughter I was going to do this, she thought it was a good idea, but she said, are you sure there's enough to write about? And I said, well, the truth is, I said, it's a little bit of a problem because your generation isn't really as funny as that older generation of Jews. And she looked at me and she said, that's okay, Daddy, you're not that funny either. So I figured, okay, that was the starting point. When visitors walk into the book center in Amherst, you're on a balcony level and you're looking out over all these stacks, laden with Yiddish books. People call it a sea of books. And what we hear more often than any other reaction, they say, who knew? Who knew that such a vast literature even existed in Yiddish? Because most Jews in America remembered Yiddish when they were kids or a certain generation, when their parents or their grandparents might have spoken the language, but they really had no clue that it had generated this vast literature. They might have heard of Shalom Aleichem. They might have heard of Fiddler on the Roof, which is a bit of a bowdlerization of Shalom Aleichem. They probably heard of Isaac Bashevis Singer, who won the Nobel Prize. Maybe Shalom Asch, who lived in London for part of his life. That was about it, though. The fact that all this existed was really quite unknown to them. And they're looking out at what they call a sea of books. For us, it's only 2% of all the books that we've collected. We have an underground library now at our facility where we store many of the books. We have a big off-site location, what we call our secure undisclosed location, in a large secure warehouse complex where we have books on pallets and we maneuver them with forklifts and they're piled high. So it's just to give you a sense of the sheer scale of all of this. But even with all those books, I mean, our goal was never to become a Geniza, just like, a repository, an annex for dead books. That was never the goal here. Rather, our goal had always been to, how do we save all these books, but much more importantly, how do we get them into the hands of new readers? It goes back to Katja Molodowski's question at the front, who's going to read these pages? Well, the demand was there, but the problem was we didn't have enough books to go around. We might have had 100 copies of a collected works of Guy de Maupassant translated into Yiddish. But when it came to a writer like Bashevis Singer, maybe we had a few copies. Like his brother, I.J. Singer, who wrote the Brothers Ashkenazi, I think we had 3 copies in all of our collection. I said, can you imagine if in all the libraries in all the world, there were only 3 copies left of, I don't know, War and Peace, or 3 copies left of Moby Dick? I said, my God, the UN would be meeting to, deal with this crisis. But in the case of Jewish books, they just not enough had survived. And some of the most popular books have been read so heavily and so avidly that they'd sort of fallen apart somewhere along the way. It was somewhere along there, actually, after we opened up our new building, that was in 1997. I founded this in 1980, 1997. We opened up the new building. For the first time, people could see all these books, and they wanted copies of them. And we didn't have enough to go around. And that was when one of the younger people on our staff said to me, I think it's time to digitize the collection. All right, so this is going to sound a little funny, but in 1997, I didn't know what the word digitize meant. It was not common parlance at that time. And I didn't consider myself a complete Luddite, but I really didn't understand what that concept meant. But we decided that it sounded like a really good idea to do this. We ended up hiring a company out of Pennsylvania. They set up a factory devoted to doing nothing but scanning Yiddish books. We began shipping copies of our titles, about 12,000 titles altogether. Back in those days, it was still pretty primitive because you had to cut the spine off the book. You know, books have a curvature to the page, and everything was xerographic in those days. And so you had a curvature that couldn't all stay in focus. So they would cut the spine off the book and feed the pages through one at a time. It was painstaking work, and then clean the lenses after every pass. But we did it, and we made all the books available. But that was just so we could generate reprints and for preservation. Then maybe 10 years after that, another young person came to see me, and he said, listen, I think the internet's finally fast enough that we could actually deliver these books to people online. In other words, post them online and people could just download the books. And I said, no kidding, how do we do that? Well, he didn't exactly know, but he thought we should start with Google. Google was then trying, one of the founders of Google was Jewish, and they were then, maybe both actually, and they were then starting this project to digitize all of the world's books that never quite came to fruition. So we talked to them, and they were sort of interested, but were a little nervous about copyright issues, which wasn't really a concern. We talked to them for maybe 6 months, never got anywhere exactly. And then the head of a major library came to see me, said, I've been talking with my big library cohort, my colleagues, he said, and we have decided you can't work with Google. And I said, no kidding, how come? He says, because he said, you know, Google might be a perfectly benign company, but the idea of one privately held corporation controlling all of the world's knowledge is not a public good. And he said, if we're going to do this, we have to do it in a public access way, in an open sort of way. So we went to a group in San Francisco called the Internet Archive that had taken on this job as a nonprofit venture. We met with the head of the group. He was really excited about this. He loved the idea of including Yiddish books in this vast collection of millions of books that they had already made available online. He said, yep, just send us a hard drive with all the books that you've scanned and I will get them online and everybody in the world can have access to them. I said, great, how long is it going to take? He said, 2 weeks top. 2 weeks tops, he said. Well, 2 years later, they finally finished everything. He didn't realize that Yiddish went from right to left instead of from, is that right? Right to left instead of from left to right. And they had to get somebody, a volunteer, to reprogram it to make this whole thing work. But finally, we didn't have any information on how many books were actually being downloaded. We went on 6 months that way. And finally, I saw that this guy, Brewster Kahle, was giving a talk at Harvard University. So I wrote to him, I said, would you like to meet for supper after your talk? He said, he would love to. We met for supper. We talked all through the meal. After they said, okay, how many downloads have we had? How many people have downloaded these books? At which point he said, let me look. And he takes out this gigantic Mac computer. For the next 15 or 20 minutes, he's typing away furiously. He's like completely lost. And finally, he looks up and he said, I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like 242,000 downloads at that point. I almost fell off my chair. You know, if it had been 10% of that, I would have been totally baffled by the phenomenon. And today that number is almost 5 million times. So 5 million times somebody has gone online, identified one of the books in our collection, and downloaded the book in its entirety. And I have to tell you, since the outbreak of the pandemic, we've had almost 1 million downloads just in that space alone. I think people have time on their hands, and far more than we ever could have imagined are reading them. Some of the people who are reading the books we know are from the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox community and Hasidic communities, which is surprising. They still speak Yiddish, not Chabad so much anymore, but the rest of the Hasidic group still speak Yiddish. But why is it surprising? Because Yiddish books, almost by definition, it's a secular literature, or at least a modern literature. Its main theme is how does one live as a Jew in a modern world with the embrace of reason? And that wasn't very high on the Hasidic hit parade, as you might imagine. So for them, these books had always been puzzle. They were treif, they were forbidden. But what was happening? Well, there's a whole new body of literature called OTD literature, which means off the derech. These are fallen Hasidim, people who have left the fold, and then a lot of them write these tell-all books about their experiences that have been quite, I can't say I actually read these, but my wife and daughters have read many, many of these books. And they tell me that one thing that all of them report is that in recent years, the average family size in the Haredi community is 9 kids. And if you've got 9 kids, and if the husband's not working and is studying instead, more often than not, you've got to get some form of public assistance. And nowadays, to do that, you need a computer. So many Hasidic families now have computers in the house. And as we like to say, what the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, couldn't accomplish in 200 years, computers seem to have done in 2 years, because a great many of the Hasidim are going online now and surreptitiously reading Yiddish books, surreptitiously because it's still not a sanctioned activity, but they do it anyways. We think that could be half of the downloads. The rest, though, are coming from something very, very different, from younger people. There's really been a transformation in Jewish historiography and the way we look at studies anyways. And in the Jewish world, we've gone from Judaic studies, the study of Judaism as a religion, to Jewish studies, which is a broader field, the study of Jews, including their religion. And for that, Yiddish sources have become much more central. And so demand has grown and grown. The other factor is that the world has changed a lot. My daughter went to a college in Minnesota that specialized in international studies. It's where Kofi Annan had gone to school. And when she graduated, they had this beautiful custom where all the international students get to march first, and they all carry the flag of their own country. How many flags do you think there were that day? Well, I didn't know what to expect, but the number was about 92, I think. 92 different countries were represented. When I was my daughter's age, I don't think I knew there were 92 different countries in the whole world, and I'm not exaggerating that. But the truth is, the world is so multicultural now that Jews want to understand who they are and what their own culture is. So many, even kids who've gone to day school, might know a lot about traditional texts, but they don't know a whole lot about their own history and where they come from and how we came to be the way we are. The truth is, we're a people, and I think more and more younger Jews understand that, and therefore are turning to us in very large numbers, wanting to learn more about what this is all about. So we are responding with a whole range of initiatives, and I know time's a little limited. Rabbi, if I go on for 15 more minutes before questions, that sound about right? I'm getting 2 thumbs up on that one. Okay, so I'll proceed accordingly. So one project we've started is something called the Universal Yiddish Library. For all the books that we've saved, we still don't have everything, and there are other Yiddish titles in other collections. So we've now done something that the Jewish world rarely does. There's an expression in Yiddish that says, Jeder macht Shabbos für sich. Everybody makes Shabbos for themselves, by themselves. And the world can't afford that any longer. It's time that we start working together, which was a very radical notion. But we teamed up with the National Library in Israel and Jerusalem, whom we absolutely loved, the YIVO Institute in New York, and the New York Public Library. And we are now pooling all of our holdings, scanning more and more titles, pooling everything into a single repository and giving a single access to all of it. And in fact, we met an amazing person along the way named Asaf Urieli, who is a character that nobody could have invented. Asaf is a true genius. He was born in South Africa. He grew up in Israel. He came to the States and studied computer science and engineering. He now lives in the French Pyrenees with his half Jewish, half Armenian wife and 2 adopted Russian kids. And he runs a software company. I once said to him, I said, so what do you actually do? Oh, I'm sorry, I got to tell you what he did. He called me up and he said, I have just invented Yiddish OCR, optical character recognition. This is the technology that allows you to figure out what every letter means so that you could search not just the books as a whole, but you can actually search inside of the books as well. So you could type in, if your family came from Bialystok, you could type in Bialystok, and instantly it would search through 12,000 titles, eventually far more than that. And it would give you every place where that word occurs. So this is a big deal because it would revolutionize Jewish scholarship. So when Asaf told me this, I didn't quite believe it originally. And then I said, so when you're not inventing Yiddish OCR, what do you do? He says, well, he owns his own software company, and they are the primary programmers for the French Space Agency. I said, you're a rocket scientist? And well, that's exactly what he did, was to support all of this. He once told me, he said, he does have this day job, but he works on Yiddish OCR twice a week. He travels from the Pyrenees and he goes down, I think, to Toulouse, and he takes the TGV train, the high-speed train that goes 300 kilometers an hour. And he said, while he's on the train, he works on this programming and working on the OCR for Yiddish. I said, it's really a shame you don't live in the States, because if you took our Amtrak, our national railroad, it's so slow you would have this project done long ago. But he has finally finished it. It's revolutionized scholarship in every possible way. Sometimes when people walk into the building, they look out at all those books and they say to me, oh, I wish my grandparents could have been here to see this. And for years, I would always think to myself, I don't want your grandparents. I want your kids. I want your grandchildren. That's who's there now. Nowadays, it is the grandchildren who are reading all of these books. And so we are doing an awful lot of work to help make that possible. We've just developed, after 8 years of nonstop effort by several people, we have developed a revolutionary new Yiddish textbook that's kind of setting the Yiddish world astir. We're training Yiddish teachers who come to Amherst, will now come to us online, learn how to use this and bring it into their classrooms. We're developing a whole range of online resources. For those who can't read Yiddish in the original, we are translating the books into English. I can't hear all of you, but anyone want to guess? Hold up your fingers. What percentage of Yiddish books do you think have been translated into English so far, of all the Yiddish titles? That would be 2%. 2%. Out of all the Yiddish books that we have, out of all those titles, only 2% have been translated into English. So there is a, I was going to say Sisyphean, but that's entirely the wrong word, Herculean task to go through all of these books and make them accessible. It's not that no books were translated. Maurice Samuel, who has lived in London for a long time, was one of the great translators back in the 30s and 40s. But the truth was, after the war, there was a tendency to translate the Schmalzier books, those that kind of showed that world in softer focus. There's a great Yiddish expression that says, alle Kalle seinen schön, alle Teute seinen fromm, which means all brides are beautiful and all dead people are pious. And I think after the war, we wanted to think that everybody was just kind of beautiful and perfect. But the truth is, the great literature is not about people who are schmaltzy and everything is perfect and beautiful. The great literature is about conflict and contradiction and sexuality and power struggles and relations between men and women and so on. And all of those great books, for the most part, many of them were overlooked. So we started a project called the New Yiddish Library originally. And our goal was to start systematically translating these books. We started out with a committee of scholars, like 15 very august professors around the world, working with us to translate the books into English. One of them, in fact, was Joseph Sherman, who came from Witwatersrand in South Africa, but ended up at Oxford University. He was the youngest of all of them, and he died very tragically in his 60s. The others were in their 80s. And we realized this wasn't really going to work out. One day I was sitting with some of our student fellows and I was explaining that we had been translating these books. I said, we're doing really well. For the last 10 years, we've managed to translate one new title a year. And one of these young guys looks at me like aghast and he said, are you kidding me? He said, you realize at the rate of a book a year, you got 39,000 books to go, 39,000 titles to go. So I said, so what would you do? And he said, it's easy. I'd wiki it, like Wikipedia, let everybody have a crack at it. Well, that was exaggerating it. That wasn't really going to work. But the notion of training a new generation of translators who could actually do this work sounded like kind of brilliant to me and sounded like the only solution. I spoke to several older scholars who said, that's impossible. I know so much. How could anyone else ever learn anything? That was not a very forward-looking solution. But others were very encouraging. We needed money to do it. So we contacted Steven Spielberg's foundation. He had been generous to it. Steven Spielberg, the filmmaker, had been very generous to us before. And then one day, the head of his foundation called me up and she said, do you have any plans to come to LA anytime soon? Because Steven wants to see you. Steven Spielberg, as a matter of principle, never meets the beneficiaries of his philanthropy. I said, really? He says, yeah, you're going to be in LA anytime soon? And I said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, and I quickly made arrangements. I was there in a week. I went on to the lot, the Universal lot, In the midst of all these sound stages and stuff, there was this very lovely little house, and that's where Stephen's operation was based. He came into the room exactly on time. He was smart, funny, totally unpretentious, and deeply Jewish, and very well informed. And he said to me, he said, you know, when I heard what you were doing with translation, he said, I just couldn't resist and I had to meet you, he said, because you have to understand, he said, I make movies, that I tell stories for a living. The idea that you have all these miles of shelves there packed with Jewish books, and nobody alive has ever read all of them, and nobody really understands what's inside most of them. He said, for me, that's absolutely irresistible. He gave us more money than we asked for, and we've been training a new generation ever since. And the really good part is they're discovering books that we have never even heard of before. I mean, this is my academic field, but they're coming up with writers that were utterly overlooked in their own time, especially women writers who were overlooked in the 40s and 50s and even in the 1960s. And there was one team, Ellen Cassidy and Aaron Taub, who found a writer named Bluma Lempel. Never heard of her name before. I'd seen her books on our shelves, but I knew nothing about her. Turns out she had started writing very late in life. She had come from the old country, but ended up first in Paris and then in New York. And she took courses at the New School. She would do in writing, went home and did her homework assignments in Yiddish instead of in English. And she ended up publishing a collection of short stories that was just translated called Oedipus in Brooklyn. And if you think that sounds wild, you ought to see the rest of the stories in the anthology. So this was definitely not the Yiddish literature that many people were expecting. A wonderful translator in Scotland named Heather Valencia has just translated a book by Mendel Mann about the early days in the state of Israel. Daniel Kennedy, who's from Ireland, now living in Paris, and did a book of prose by Avram Sutzkever, the great poet of the Vilna Ghetto. One of my favorites is a woman named Rose Waldman, who actually studied with us for 2 years in a row. And then I found out she was actually a Satmar Chassid. If my wife had gone with me to meet her, she would have seen in 2 seconds that she was wearing a shaitel, that she had a wig on. I don't notice these kind of things, so that passed me by. But she is in fact a Satmar Hungarian Chassid. And she went to school. She told me after her kids were grown, she went out and she got a BA at Hunter College. And then she went to Columbia University and got an MFA in creative writing and studied with us. And now she was translating Yiddish literature. And she's one of the best translators at work today. So, you know, the world is full of surprises in every possible way. There are right now hundreds, and there'll eventually be thousands of titles translated that will be coming around, and I think will be astonishing to everyone. We're also doing oral history, recording interviews with Jews all over the world. Jews love to tell stories, as you all know. And so you got to bring plenty of tape with you. Now we have, you know, digital, but people love to talk. We have a non-Jewish woman who runs that program. In Yiddish, there's an expression that says a gast auf a while seht a mile. Someone who's here, a guest who's here for just a little while sometimes can see a mile, because you have, fewer preconceptions. She has now recorded over 1,000 interviews, each one at least 2 hours in length. These are all posted online, and they've been downloaded or been viewed online, I think about 6 or 7 million times right now. So the scale of this, I think, is probably what's most surprising. And then we run a whole range of educational programs for high school students, college students, adults, all of which have been equally transformative. And if I had more time, I would tell you more about all those, except to say that there are far more students than we can possibly handle. This last summer, we realized that we couldn't bring people to Amherst. It was too dangerous to do that with COVID raging. And so we put all the courses online. I didn't know if anyone was going to show up. And instead, the students rolled with it and they loved it. And we were able to extend the length of the programs. We also started public lecture series to bring our content to the world. There were really obscure subjects. Some of them, we did a talk a few weeks ago on Jews and Mahjong, you know, the domino game of Mahjong, which Jews seem to love. And it was a Jews and Mahjong. And if we had offered that program in our own auditorium before the pandemic, maybe we'd have had 20 or 30 people show up for it. Online, we had about 3,000 people that night. So it's transformed our work in all sorts of ways that are all very, very promising to us. Let me quickly look at my notes to see what I absolutely can't skip over. All right, another hour and I'll cover all of it, but there's too much else to say, except that the world really is changing in every possible way. You know, anti-Semitism is on the rise, I know there, and in the United States too right now. And one of the side effects of that is it does make Jews more eager to understand themselves. We're not going to let other people define us. We need to understand our own story. And I think people are drawn to that more than ever before. There was a great Jewish writer named Lansky. He had been a revolutionary. He became a professional ethnographer. And he once pointed out, he said, there is no other people on earth that spend so much time talking about themselves, yet know so little about themselves as the Jews. That was 100 years ago, and I think it's like doubly true today. The insight is an important one. But times have changed in every possible way. You want one quick joke before I finish? My daughter told me this one. So there was this modern Orthodox couple on the Upper West Side of New York City. It's like a nice liberal neighborhood. And the first day of spring, they have a new baby. And the first day they put the baby in the carriage and they're pushing the baby, the son, down Broadway. And a friend stops them and looks into the carriage and says, oh my God, what a beautiful baby. What's his name? And the parents say, oh, his name is Shloimi. We named him in memory of his grandfather, Scott. So you see how times are changing in many, many ways and continue to change. So the truth of the matter is, if we're going to regenerate Jewish life, we can't do it ex nihilo. You can't like invent it from scratch and ignore the last few thousand years of history and ignore 1,000 years of literature and ignore the language which was spoken by more Jews in more places for a longer period of time than any other of the 20 Jewish languages in history, including Hebrew. It is absolutely critical. And the truth is, we are heir to treasures beyond measure. I think young people more than ever need to connect with that and are eager to connect with it. And they really have begun turning those yellow pages. And from where I sit, the future's never looked brighter. Okay, I think I did it in right on schedule. We have 15 minutes for questions. So Rabbi, you want to open up unmute people and we can have a free-for-all?
You're absolutely fantastic. Thank you very, very much indeed, Reverend.
My pleasure. Thank you.
What you've been able to accomplish is absolutely staggering, and to consider the fact that there is so much out there that is so untapped, and so much which, as you were saying, is drawn on from years of experience and years of culture and years of Jewish life, which they're then trying to pour out into these pages to a completely new audience. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor to questions. I'm going to quickly remind everyone how they can do that. Anyone who wishes to ask a question can use the raise hand function in the participants icon. There you go. We've already got one on there. We'll come to you in a minute, Judge Kryman. You can also send us a message on the chat and we can read that out. You can do it privately or send us a message in some other way. Jeanette, I can see you've got a thumb up as well. I'm going to take that as a question so you can come in after Judge Kryman. I've actually got one quick question. Do you have a particular favorite or cherished, prized mutzia?
A treasure?
Yeah.
Do I have a particular favorite? I do. And somehow my favorite is maybe a lot of people's favorite, and that would be Tevye de Milchike by Shalom Aleichem, Tevye the Dairyman. I think it's got everything in it. You know, it's a book that has one of the great themes of literature, which is conflicts between parents and children. But unlike Turgenev, say, with fathers and sons, it's from the point of view of the parents rather than the point of view of the children. And it's brilliant, and it's dialectical, and it's profoundly funny. And I think it's as enduring today as it was in the day it was written. So yes, I love that. And I'll just tell you, one of the tricks that Tevye always does, he always gives these quotations where he'll say something in Hebrew, translate into Yiddish, and the Yiddish translation is always wrong. And I think some people thought, oh, he's an ignoramus, he knows nothing. But of course, it's not that it's exactly wrong, it's that it's reinterpreted in some way. And there's a profundity in that. I've always thought it wasn't just Hebrew and it wasn't just Yiddish that gave strength to Jews. It was the juxtaposition between the two that made us strongest. And that's exactly what Tevye manages to do.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay, Judge Kryman, we're going to put you in over here.
Thank you, Rabbi. Much obliged. Good evening, Mr. Lansky. First of all, I think you understand that. Secondly, I disagree with your daughter. You are very funny. Thirdly, I have in my library behind me here a beautiful book written over 100 years ago, which has got 2 sides to each page, and it's how to write a letter in English. And you've got the original Yiddish and then the Goyish English. But that's all right. My question is this: you mentioned Guy de Maupassant. Are you telling me that Guy de Maupassant has been translated from French, which I read at school, into Yiddish?
Yes, I'm telling you that, and I think 13 volumes, if I'm not mistaken. But it gets even better, Judge, because it was given away as a premium to subscribers to one of the Yiddish newspapers in New York. So if you subscribe to the paper, you got the whole 13 volume set. And as a result, we probably have 500 copies of those set up, standing on our shelves. The readership's a bit limited these days, but the books are still there.
Fantastic. Thank you. Don't call me Judge, call me Shlomi, but my name's not Scott.
Shlomi it is. And I'll just add that there's a vast range of world literature translated into Yiddish. Basheva Singer, in fact, translated All Quiet on the Western Front by Remarque. Thomas Mann's books, The Magic Mountain, he translated into, this is when he was a young man and trying to make a living. You can find just about most of the major works. One of the most popular writers in Yiddish, ironically, was Newt Hamsun, which I think Jews found fascinating as stories about a very different world. Before he became an anti-Semite, and that was a different story altogether. Jack London, you know, I think it opened up Jews' horizons in all sorts of ways.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Jeanette, good evening.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. 2.5 questions. Do you have your own publisher when you publish, or is everything that you're translating now published online only? And relating to that, if I wanted to buy a translated English book, where can I get hold of it? And particularly one book I would love to get, I just can't remember his name at the moment, the poet from the Vilna Ghetto, wonderful poet, you mentioned his name.
Avram Sutzkever.
Yes, thank you. Does his book exist in English translation? If so, where can I get it?
Okay, all great questions. So for a number of years, we used to publish the books that we commissioned, the translations that we generated through commercial publishers, but they often went to academic presses, which end up being very, very expensive. So we finally started our own imprint. Our logo is the Klein Weiss Ziegler, the little white goat, which figures prominently in Jewish folklore. And so we call it White Goat Press. And we now have a growing list of titles there, mostly of our own translations. Others, though, are published elsewhere, and you can find all of them on our website, or most of those titles on our website. It's yiddishbookcenter.org, not com, but org, O-R-G, all one word, Yiddish Book Center. Oh, and that's an American center, right? C-E-N-T-E-R.
Yiddish Book Center, what?
Center spelled C-E-N-T-E-R, the American style. Yeah, right. .org. But you'll find a whole list there. You can also go to an ancillary site that we maintain called Read Great Jewish Books, all one word, .com.
Thank you.
And those are study guides for a very wide range of Yiddish and other literature available in English. In terms of finding the actual books, I'm happy to tell you that Daniel Kennedy's translation of Avram Sutzkever's prose works is just going to press, literally is on press right now, and will be out very, very soon. And if you go to our website, you'll be able to find that easily. And even though our doors are closed, people still put on masks and come in and ship out books. So you'll get to be very happy to send that to you. And you know, if you want to just find out more, because we have a lot of titles in our own bookstore as well, I think you can find many of those online through the website.
Great, thank you very much.
Of course.
Thank you, Jeanette. Before we come to James, there's a question that I've had on the chat over here. Are there any Yiddish books that we would recognize as a joke book?
As a joke book?
As a joke book.
Well, you may not be surprised to hear that humor figures very centrally in Yiddish literature. Considering all the tsuras that we've endured as a people, it's hard to believe, but it's a traditional Jewish response to troubles and heartache and adversity to respond with humor, and therefore that really permeates the whole literature. You know, there's a story by Shalom Aleichem, the Tevye stories, they're actually, everybody thinks of them as funny. They're actually pretty tragic. I mean, they go from bad to worse. So in one of the stories, the daughter ends up falling in love with the nephew of a rich man. And it's suggested that she becomes pregnant by him. The rich man won't allow any marriage to happen. And eventually the daughter commits suicide. And Shalom Aleichem comes home, and Tevye comes home. And the way the story is structured is Tevye, this dairyman, is talking to Shalom Aleichem, this Russified writer, and explaining what happened and all. And finally, he can't take anymore. And he says, but enough of all this, Mr. Shalom Aleichem. He says, who wants to talk about all these things? He says, let's talk about happier things. He says, what's the latest news with the cholera epidemic in Odessa? So I think that kind of humor it's very Jewish in some way. However, there were also, as you would expect, ethnographers who got into the act and collected Jewish jokes and Jewish expressions. And there are a great many of those that are in print. And if you call our bibliographer, I know that he'd be very happy to refer you to various books if you're able to read Yiddish. I should add, by the way, that our bibliographer is a man named David Mazauer. He had worked at the BBC for 25 years as an editor of NewsHour on the BBC World Service. He was a passionate reader of Yiddish literature. His great-grandfather was the great Yiddish writer Shalom Asch. And some years ago, David contacted me and said, you know, I'm thinking of leaving the BBC and devoting my life to Yiddish literature full-time. Would you be interested? Well, it took me about 10 minutes to have him hired and on board. And he's been with us ever since. And he's vastly knowledgeable. So if you call the Yiddish Book Center and David Mazauer, M-A-Z-O-W-E-R, you will, he will certainly call you back and be very happy to speak with you and guide you to any of those sort of titles.
Thank you very much. All right, James, over to you. You're up.
Good evening, Rabbi. Good evening, sir. I want to say, and the Rabbi will bear this out, that I can often be very difficult to impress. But I want to say to you, I think you're saving the world one book at a time. Speaking only for myself in terms of my Jewish journey, of knowing that kind of literature was out there, even though you know, access to it is something else, was a really key part of my reconnection to Yiddishkeit. So it's really special what you're doing. We are a people of the book, and what I want to ask you is twofold. One, would you leave your contact details behind for anybody that you keep giving all this wonderful information of all the different things you're doing, and I get the feeling that some of us might want to contact you in the future. And the second thing I wanted to ask you is, what is your message for the Jewish world in terms of how it values its literature, not only Yiddish, but other sources as well?
Sure. Well, on the logistical side, just getting that information, Rabbi, could you take care of it?
With pleasure.
Yeah, if you could send out an email or something and just let people know, and you can contact Suzanne, my assistant. She'd be happy to give you whatever you need. And so we'd be very thrilled to hear from you. We have 35 people on our staff. They're all terrific, and we'd be very, very happy to help in any way we possibly can. And then, I'm sorry, the second part of the question was?
The second part of the question was, what is your message for? I get the feeling you're a bookworm. You've fallen in love with this stuff. I love it as well. I'm not very good at explaining why it's important. What is your message for the Jewish world? Why we should value our literature?
Well, my message to the Jewish world, for starters, would be one sentence in Yiddish, which is Shem sich nicht. Don't be ashamed. You know, I think for many years we've allowed people to redefine us, to deride us, to diminish us. But the truth is, we are heir to an extraordinary tradition. We have thousands of years of texts. We have 20 different languages. We have it really is a civilization in every sense of the word. And I think for us not to embrace that would be the height of foolishness. I think that we are so blessed, we are so lucky, we are so privileged that I think we just have to begin to come to terms with our own riches, begin to explore them, and begin to therefore use that as a foundation for new creativity.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Lovely. I've got one extra question here, and then we're going to dive over to the Feldmans to finish us off for the evening. The question I have here: are there similar initiatives that actually deal with the other Jewish languages? Are you aware of?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Well, of course, Hebrew we don't have to worry about. The National Library of Israel, and does a great deal in preserving Hebrew texts, as does Oxford University and many others. But in terms of all the other languages, although there are 20 Jewish languages, only Yiddish generated, apart from Hebrew, only Yiddish and Aramaic, obviously, generated this vast literature, this vast modern literature. So it's a bit sui generis, but not completely. For example, Ladino generated maybe 5,000 titles of modern literature. And we've been working with a professor at the University of Washington in Washington State, who's a remarkably young guy named Devin Nar. I think one parent was Sephardic, the family was from Salonika originally, and one was an Ashkenazic family, but he's quite embraced his Sephardic heritage. And he now teaches Ladino and Sephardic culture in university. And he contacted me at one point that he wanted to do for Ladino books what we had done for Yiddish books. And we put ourselves totally at his disposal. I even flew out there once to meet with him and some of his colleagues. I don't know how many books he's collected so far. Again, I don't think it's anything of the scale of what existed with Yiddish. I think that was an a one-off. But he certainly is working on doing that, and I know there are other people around the world. So yes, I think all of this continues to happen.
Thank you very much. Right, Rabbi Feldman, Iber to ear. I think that's accurate. That was over to you in Yiddish. Hopefully.
Yeah, no. I worked it out. Okay. This is how I'd like to conclude with a bit of an anecdote, or intergenerational anecdote. As you could probably hear from my accent, I'm a Brooklyn boy, and my family came to the United States, to Ellis Island, at the end of the 19th century, or somewhere around that time period. And my grandmother, who celebrated Kanai Nahara, her 94th birthday, on Zoom last week, told me the story that in the 1910s and 1920s, she was living in the Lower East Side, or maybe it was Williamsburg, I'm not sure which one. And she was a newly married, or something, or a teenager, and she was friendly with a rabbi who said to her, "Fagi, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it." And he gave his first lecture in English instead of Yiddish to the yeshiva, to the students. And it was a phenomenal success, and opened up, scholarship in America, which was really closed because of being exclusively Yiddish. And she was very proud of that story. But my grandmother, Fagi, has a Queen's English, or at least the equivalent over here. But her Yiddish is impeccable as well. My mother, who grew up hearing Yiddish in the house but never spoke it, made it her mission to relearn Yiddish. And she became a born-again Yiddish speaker. And as I was growing up as a teenager, I was bombarded with her desperation to try to get me to speak Yiddish. I wanted nothing to do with it until I went to Israel and found myself in the yeshiva, where Yiddish wasn't used as a language to study with. It was just what the rabbis spoke amongst themselves. But I was in the yeshiva for 5 years, and by the time I had left, I cared enough about what they were saying to get a taste for Yiddish. That took me on my next 5-year journey, where I spent 5 years, 5 days a week, having a 90-minute lecture in Yiddish every single day.
Wow.
Where Yiddish became more familiar to me than Ivrit, even though I was actually living in Israel. And what my grandmother thinks about that journey is, rather than the old becoming the new again, but the taking of the old, having that journey through through the reemergence into the modern. And instead of having Yiddish finding its place again, but rather it being an even more elevated place than it was originally. That's my opinion. But I think if my opinion is correct, that's exactly what you're achieving. You're not trying to exhume a grave, but rather trying to take the richness of the past, using the present and creating a better Jewish future. That's an opinion.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you very much, Rabbi. That's beautiful. Yeah.
And the fact that you have been willing to share that with us, your genius, your energy, your passion, you are an inspiration. And if any of us could even aspire to take some of our own heritage, as we say, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kikedem, to bring back the days of yore, but new. And if we could take some of that passion and try to do that with our own heritage and our own personal stories, with our own pride in our Judaism, based upon the time that you've given us, hopefully that will have been worthwhile on your part, but certainly something truly important from our end as well. So thank you so much on behalf of our community for lighting a bit of a flame that we hope to hopefully create into something really special.
That's wonderful. And I'm going to end by just extending an invitation to all of you. So this pandemic is not going to go on forever. Mitzvah Hashem, there will be a vaccine. We will have the vaccine. The world will change again. Everything will open up. And when it does, if you have a hankering for some travel, come to the States and come visit us. We're open 6 days a week, and we love having people walk into the building. And I will personally greet you if you come in there. And I promise you that will be well worth the trip. And if I get to the UK, perhaps we can meet there as well. So to all of you, I just want to say thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll definitely add it to our next travel plans. It sounds great.
Absolutely. Before we conclude, this has been the final installment of this year's BLT. BLT, Bushy Learns Together. We have certainly done that. And we've covered a wealth of topics, as well as reaching into different parts of the Jewish world to do so. The thanks goes to the fantastic Cats, Rabbi Nick and Shira, for spearheading this year's virtual BLT. A massive thank you for all of their efforts, which have really bore fruits. Yasha Kayach, really well done. We have in the winter break the Bereshit series, which we are advertising as well. Further great stuff, all available and all really richly worthwhile, including some of our own rabbinic team who will be leading the sessions. So please, please sign up and to continue enjoying, and also an opportunity as well to for further things that we'll have as well. Our Hanukkah program, the lighting in the car park in the shul, as well as our menorah mobile, and we also have a trip to the Museum of Natural History, where we'll have a guided tour where Genesis creation meets the text through the evidence of archaeology, which is going to be absolutely phenomenal. Mr. Lansky, if you're available, I'm sure you'd find that interesting as well, which is all online to go and take a look. And beyond that, also with the shul open, look forward to doing some learning in person. But for now, thank you all so much for being part of this journey of BLT for this season, and wishing you all a be gesund.